To the world, they were Hollywood royalty, the dashing Humphrey Bogart and the sultry Lauren Bacall. Their chemistry sizzled on screen, and their whirlwind romance seemed to defy the odds of age, ego, and the brutal glare of fame. But behind the smoke-filled rooms and iconic black-and-white photos was a marriage far more fragile, far more turbulent, and far darker than the public ever knew. In her later years, Lauren Bacall peeled back the glamorous facade, exposing what had truly existed between her and Bogey, a man the world adored, but who left deep scars on the woman who loved him the most. From his unrelenting alcoholism and unpredictable rages to the crushing loneliness she endured in silence, Bacall revealed a truth that wasn't so golden. Her confession wasn't tabloid fodder, it was raw, reflective, and at times disturbing. Why did Bacall stay? What did she endure? And why did she wait decades to tell the truth about a man still revered as one of cinema's greatest legends? This is not the love story Hollywood wants you to remember. This is the version Lauren Bacall needed the world to hear. The story of survival, silence, and a marriage that was beautiful. Until it wasn't. They met on the Warner Brothers lot in 1944. He was 44. She was just 19. Humphrey Bogart was already a film icon. The tough guy with the gravel voice and a cigarette hanging from his lips. Lauren Bacall, a young model-turned-actress, was making her screen debut in To Have and Have Not. The chemistry between them was immediate, electric, and undeniable. What began as an on-screen pairing quickly spiraled into one of Hollywood's most talked-about romances. But while the cameras captured the romance, they never caught what really happened after the director called cut. To the press, they were magic. Lauren, with her smoldering gaze and cool elegance, seemed to tame the hard-drinking, chain-smoking Bogart. He left his third wife for her. They married in 1945 and became the ultimate Hollywood power couple, charming interviewers, attending premieres arm in arm, and co-starring in films like The Big Sleep and Key Largo. But Bacall would later admit it was all a performance. In her memoir, By Myself, Bacall revealed that her marriage was built not just on love, but on silence, her silence. Bogart's drinking, which was already excessive when they met, worsened as the years went on. He would disappear into drinking binges, fall into foul moods, or become emotionally distant without warning. Bacall described being alone in a room with him and still feeling invisible. He would sit, drink in hand, and vanish into himself, she wrote. I would sit beside him, waiting for the man I married to come back. But it wasn't just the alcohol. Bogart, for all his brilliance, was a deeply controlling man. He loathed the idea of Bacall working unless it suited him. Though she had dreams of building her own career, she often had to ask for permission to take roles. If she accepted something he didn't like, he'd sulk, or worse, accuse her of chasing fame at the expense of their home. Bacall, still barely into her 20s, found herself in a prison gilded with movie star charm. What made matters worse was that the world didn't want to believe any of it. To the public, Bogey was untouchable, the romantic anti-hero, the man who'd gone toe-to-toe with crime bosses and heartbreak. Bacall often felt she had no one to confide in. Even her closest friends would brush off her concerns with lines like, "That's just Bogart. He's complicated." But to Bacall, it wasn't complexity, it was pain, loneliness, disillusionment. Despite everything, she stayed. Why? Love, loyalty, and fear. He had this sadness in him, she later said. This deep, unspoken sadness. I thought if I left, I'd destroy him. And for a time, things did seem to improve, especially after the birth of their children. But the shadow of Bogart's demons never fully disappeared. Even in their happiest moments, Bacall admitted to feeling like she was sharing her life with a ghost. Behind the legend of Bogey and Bacall was a marriage shaped as much by regret as it was by romance. Bacall gave everything to keep it together, her voice, her ambition, her youth. But as she grew older, and especially after Bogart's death in 1957, she began to reclaim the story. And when she finally spoke the truth, it wasn't with bitterness. It was with clarity. I loved him, she wrote. But love doesn't erase the damage. Lauren Bacall had grown up fast. By the time she was 21, she wasn't just a movie star. She was married to one of the most powerful men in Hollywood. But what most people didn't see was the heavy emotional price she paid behind closed doors, in a home clouded by alcohol and regret. Humphrey Bogart, for all his cinematic charm and quiet intensity, was a man drowning in his own darkness. And Bacall, too young and too in love to recognize the full danger, was pulled in right beside him. She had hoped their marriage would be a partnership, a balance of two strong-willed artists navigating fame together. But alcohol slowly took over. The man who had once whispered poetry in her ear and stared at her like she was the only woman in the world began disappearing, day by day, into a glass. Scotch, bourbon, gin? It didn't matter. Bacall described nights when Bogart would drink in silence, avoiding eye contact, his thoughts miles away. He wasn't violent, but his absence was just as bruising. He would vanish without leaving the room, she once said. I'd speak, and it was like throwing words into a canyon. As Bogart's dependence worsened, so did his moods. The actor known for calm, cool detachment on screen could be bitter and sharp in private. Bacall endured passive-aggressive comments about her looks, her ambitions, and especially her work. He didn't like me being too independent, she wrote. He liked the idea of me, but not always the reality. Friends of the couple later recalled how Bogart would put her down with sarcasm or cutting jokes at parties. Bacall, ever poised, would laugh along, but inside, it chipped away at her. She longed for connection, but the bottle always came first. The man she married would often choose late-night drinking sessions with his Rat Pack friends, Frank Sinatra, David Niven, and others, over time with his wife and children. Bacall often found herself alone at home, putting the kids to bed while her husband stayed out until dawn. When he did come home, he reeked of cigarettes and whiskey, his eyes hollow, his words slurred. He'd pass out before they could speak, and by morning, it was like nothing had happened. It became a cycle, she later said. A performance. One I didn't audition for but couldn't leave. Despite her pain, Bacall protected his image, publicly at least. The studio system of the 1950s demanded the illusion of perfection. Marital troubles were seen as weakness, especially for actresses. Bacall was expected to smile through it, to be Bogey's girl, even as her husband slowly disappeared into addiction. I had to play a part, even when the cameras were off, she admitted. And sometimes that was the hardest role of all. What's tragic is how many people knew, but no one helped. In those days, alcoholism wasn't discussed with compassion or concern. It was dismissed as part of the artist's temperament, a byproduct of genius. Bogart's behavior was seen as classic Hollywood hard-living, not the cry for help it truly was. Bacall, isolated and overwhelmed, had nowhere to turn. Everyone adored him, she said. But they never asked what it was like to live with him. Still, she stayed. Not because she was weak, but because she still believed in the man she had fallen in love with. The man who, on rare sober mornings, would hold her hand in the kitchen and say, "You're the best thing that ever happened to me." But those moments became fewer and farther between, and for Lauren Bacall, those quiet, broken mornings would linger in her memory far longer than the movie scenes ever did. From the outside, Lauren Bacall's life looked like every aspiring actress's dream. She was married to the most iconic man in Hollywood, living in a Beverly Hills mansion, raising beautiful children, attending black-tie galas, and starring in hit films. But inside that glittering cage, Bacall was suffocating. The image was perfect, but the reality was isolating, stifling, and emotionally cold. The girl who had once captivated Bogart with a glance had become a prop in his world, carefully positioned for public admiration, but rarely heard or seen for who she truly was. The first red flag was the silence. Bogart was a man of few words, and Bacall was willing to accept that, at first. But as the years passed, that silence turned into emotional neglect. Conversations became shallow. Affection became routine. The rare moments of tenderness were often followed by distance or dismissiveness. "We stopped talking," Bacall later confessed. Not because we had nothing to say, but because he didn't want to hear it. She wasn't allowed to challenge him. If she did, he'd withdraw further, sometimes leaving for days under the excuse of needing space. And Bacall, barely in her 20s, was left in a whirlwind of doubt, resentment, and self-blame. She tried to reclaim herself through her career. But even that came with conditions. Bogart didn't like her working without him. He was proud of her talent, but only when it served his narrative. When she accepted roles in films he wasn't part of, it sparked tension. He would subtly question her loyalty, accusing her of chasing fame instead of prioritizing their family. "He didn't shout," Bacall wrote. "He didn't forbid me. He just made it hard to breathe." Slowly she began turning down offers. Not because she wanted to, but because the emotional cost of saying yes was too high. Motherhood, too, became part of the performance. Bacall adored her children, but she often raised them alone. Bogart, already in his 50s by the time they were born, was more preoccupied with his friends, his boat, and his scotch than late-night feedings or school pickups. Bacall became the caretaker, the scheduler, the one who kept the house running, while the world praised Bogart as the perfect family man. "People assumed he was this wonderful father," she said bitterly in a later interview. "And he loved his kids, but he didn't raise them. I did. The most heartbreaking part was the loneliness. Trapped in a marriage worshipped by the public, Bacall couldn't admit how alone she felt. Hollywood didn't allow women like her, young, beautiful, married to a legend, to complain. She was expected to smile at the premieres, hold her husband's hand in front of the cameras, and go home to silence. And so she kept pretending that the man beside her was still her partner, pretending she wasn't heartbroken, pretending she hadn't given up pieces of herself to keep an illusion alive. Over time, she began to see the truth. She wasn't a wife in the way she had imagined. She was part of a myth, Bogey and Bacall, a brand, a legend, something for the magazines to idolize and the fans to worship. But behind the glamorous photos, there was a woman slowly losing her voice. And that's what hurt her the most. Not the drinking, not the jealousy, not even the emotional distance. What devastated Bacall was that somewhere along the way, she stopped being Lauren and became someone else entirely. Someone created for his spotlight, not her own, and yet she stayed. Not because it was easy, but because she didn't yet know how to leave. Humphrey Bogart died in 1957, leaving Lauren Bacall a widow at just 32 years old. The world mourned the loss of a legend, while Bacall stood quietly beside his casket, composed, graceful, and stoic, just as everyone expected her to be. She was the grieving widow of Hollywood's most beloved leading man, and once again, she played the part perfectly. But the real story of their marriage, the one she couldn't tell while he was alive, was only beginning to rise to the surface. And when she finally told it decades later, it wasn't a scandalous exposé. It was something much more painful. The testimony of a woman who gave everything for love and nearly lost herself in the process. For years after Bogart's death, Bacall remained loyal to his memory. She refused to speak ill of him in public. Even when she published her first memoir, By Myself, in 1978, she was careful, honest, but respectful. Yet between the lines, the truth leaked out. The loneliness, the drinking, the resentment, the suffocation. "There were things I couldn't say when he was here," she wrote in later years, "and things I still hesitate to say because I loved him." But love doesn't always look like a fairy tale. Sometimes it looks like survival. Bacall went on to rebuild her career, appearing on stage, returning to film, and even earning a Tony Award and an honorary Oscar. But she was no longer the wide-eyed ingenue from To Have and Have Not. She was hardened, wiser. Her voice, once silky and seductive, carried the edge of a woman who had seen too much and been silent for too long. In interviews, she grew more candid, especially as she aged and no longer felt the need to protect the myths of old Hollywood. And when asked about Bogart, she no longer sugarcoated the pain. "I didn't leave him," she once said, "but that doesn't mean I stayed happily. I stayed because I didn't know how to unlove him." Those words struck a chord with millions of women, especially those who had once found themselves trapped in relationships that looked perfect from the outside, but felt like slow erasure behind closed doors. To Bacall, Bogart was not a villain. He was not abusive in the way tabloids might imagine, but he was flawed, broken, and burdened by demons that he never truly faced. His charm, wit, and talent made the world forgive everything, but Lauren Bacall had lived with the cost of that forgiveness. She bore the weight of the silences, the nights alone, the constant act of being Bogey's girl when she desperately wanted to be herself. One of the most heartbreaking things she ever admitted was this: "He taught me how to love and how to disappear." That contradiction followed her for the rest of her life. Even in her later years, when honored by film institutions and critics, Bacall would often shift the conversation away from Bogart, not out of bitterness, but perhaps exhaustion. She had spent a lifetime being half of something iconic, and she wanted to be remembered for her own story, not just the one she had survived. Lauren Bacall passed away in 2014 at the age of 89, and while her name will forever be linked to Humphrey Bogart, her legacy is far more than that of a Hollywood wife. She was a woman who endured, who waited decades to tell her truth, and who finally, when the spotlight faded, used her voice not to destroy, but to heal. She never asked the world to hate Bogart. She only asked the world to finally hear her.